The rain in Seoul didn't just fall, it punished. Naira Coleman knelt in the mud of the cemetery, her fingers numb as she traced the cold marble of Daniel's headstone. At 24, she was a widow, her heart buried 6 feet under with the only man who had ever truly seen her. "Get up, Naira. You're getting mud on your morning dress, and it's embarrassing." A sharp voice sliced through the rhythm of the downpour. Naira looked up to see Marcus Coleman, her father-in-law, holding a silk umbrella as if it were a shield against the very air she breathed. Beside him, her brother-in-law Derek smirked, checking his gold watch. "He's been dead a year," Derek sneered. "And since you couldn't even give him an heir, you've outstayed your welcome in the Coleman estate. The companies, the cars, the accounts, they're ours. You're officially a guest in your own house, and your reservation just expired." Naira's voice was a ragged whisper. "Daniel promised I'd always be taken care of." "Daniel is a ghost," Marcus countered, leaning in close. "But I have a proposition. A business partner in the underworld needs a wife, a nurse to manage his affairs and his physical limitations. Park Hyun-seok. He's the head of the park syndicate, but an accident left him a paralyzed shell in a wheelchair. Marry him, and I'll let you keep the deed to your house. Refuse, and you'll be sleeping on these graves by midnight." Naira felt the trap closing. She had heard of the Park family, the shadow dragons of Seoul. Hyun-seok was whispered to be a monster, a man whose coldness was even more crippled than his legs. But as she looked at the cruel, greedy eyes of the in-laws who had turned her life into a living hell, a spark of desperate defiance flickered in her chest. She didn't know that the man in the wheelchair was watching her through a long-range lens from a black sedan parked at the cemetery gates. She didn't know that Park Hyun-seok was faking his weakness to see who would remain loyal when the dragon appeared to have lost its fire. The Colemans thought they were discarding a nuisance. They didn't realize they were hand-delivering a queen to her king, and that the man they called broken was about to stand up and burn their world to the ground. "Hello, family. Nice to have you back here. Before we proceed, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comment and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here." Now let's dive into the story. The Coleman penthouse, once a sanctuary of glass and light overlooking the shimmering Han River, had become a gilded cage that smelled of cold tea and betrayal. For 365 days, Naira had moved through these halls like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs Daniel had bought to celebrate their first anniversary. But the man who had loved her was gone, and in his place remained the vultures who shared his blood but none of his heart. Naira stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the neon lights of Seoul blur through the relentless rain. She heard the heavy click of Marcus's Italian leather shoes against the marble floor before she heard his voice. It was a sound that always made her shoulders tighten, a Pavlovian response to a year of psychological warfare. "I trust you've finished packing the silver, Naira," Marcus said, his voice smooth and devoid of any familial warmth. He stood at the wet bar, pouring himself a glass of whiskey that probably cost more than Naira's monthly allowance. "Though, technically, you shouldn't even be touching it. It's Coleman property now. Everything in this room, from the art on the walls to the air you're breathing, belongs to the estate." Naira turned, her deep brown skin glowing faintly under the dim-recessed lighting, though her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. "This was our home, Marcus." Daniel's will was clear. Daniel's will was written under the assumption that he would have an heir, Gloria Coleman interjected as she drifted into the room, her silk robe billowing behind her like a shroud. She didn't look at Naira. She never did if she could help it. Her eyes were fixed on a line of designer handbags sitting on the foyer table. "A wife who produces nothing is merely a temporary guest. Our lawyers have spent the last 12 months ensuring that temporary has reached its expiration date." Marcus set his glass down with a deliberate clack. "Let's stop the theatrics. You have no money, no family in this country, and by midnight, you won't even have a roof. However, I've found a way for you to remain useful. I have a business associate, a man of immense influence who has recently suffered a tragic setback. Park Hyun-seok." The name hung in the air like a cold front. Even in the upper echelons of Seoul's elite, the Park name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and terror. They weren't just businessmen, they were the architects of the city's shadows. "He's a monster," Naira whispered, her voice trembling. "I've heard the stories. They call him the Shadow Dragon, People who cross him don't just lose their money, they disappear. People who cross him are fools, Marcus corrected, stepping into her personal space. But Hyun Seok is currently indisposed. A suspicious accident left him paralyzed from the waist down. He's confined to a wheelchair, trapped in that fortress of a mansion, and his board of directors is getting restless. They want him to show stability. They want him to have a wife, specifically, a wife who knows how to be quiet, how to serve, and how to maintain the image of a devoted caretaker. Naira felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. You're selling me to a mob boss because he needs a nurse. I am giving you a life, Marcus hissed, his face inches from hers. Hyun Seok needs a wife to keep his empire's image intact, and in exchange he is clearing the debts Derek racked up in Macau. It's a perfect trade. You marry him, you move into his estate, and I let you keep the deed to this penthouse. You can even keep Daniel's old flight logs and personal effects. But if you refuse... He paused, pulling a smartphone from his pocket. With a casual swipe, he showed her a live feed of the penthouse's front door. 2 men in black suits were already standing there, holding high-tech locksmith tools. One word from me, and they change the codes. You'll be on the street in your morning clothes with nothing but the rain to cover you. No phone, no bank cards, nothing. Think about it, Naira. Is your pride worth more than a roof over your head? You're already a widow. What's one more dead marriage to a man who can't even stand up to touch you? The cruelty of his words felt like a physical blow. Naira looked around the room, seeing the ghost of Daniel in every corner, the way he used to laugh while making coffee, the way he promised her that Seoul would be their kingdom. Now, the kingdom was being dismantled by the very people he had trusted. She looked at Marcus, then at the legal contract sitting on the mahogany table, its white pages gleaming like a surrender flag. She realized then that she was trapped between 2 types of monsters, the ones who wore expensive suits and stole with pens, and the one who sat in a wheelchair and ruled with blood. I'll do it, she said, her voice barely audible over the thunder rattling the glass. I knew you were a sensible girl, Gloria said, finally looking at her with a smug, victorious grin. Don't bother with the luggage, the parks provide everything there. Property requires. Naira picked up the pen. As she signed her name, her heart felt like a lead weight sinking into the ocean. She was traded, sold, and discarded. But as she handed the paper back to Marcus, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the window. The tears were there, but beneath them was a cold, hard resolve. If she had to live in a den of dragons to survive, she would. She just didn't know that the dragon she was about to meet was already waiting for her to arrive. The transition from the Coleman penthouse to the Park estate was a journey through a landscape of iron and stone. As the black sedan wound its way toward the outskirts of Seoul, the vibrant neon of the city faded, replaced by the towering, rain-slicked walls of a fortress that seemed to swallow the gray morning light. Naira sat in the back seat, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned a ghostly shade of gray against her deep brown skin. She was still wearing the same black dress from the cemetery, a somber contrast to the stark, clinical luxury of the estate she was about to call home. The wedding was not a celebration, it was a transaction. It took place in a cavernous foyer paved with obsidian-colored marble that reflected the dim, cold light of a minimalist chandelier. There were no flowers to mask the scent of floor wax and expensive cologne, and no music to drown out the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown to an execution. Standing near the far wall, Marcus and Gloria Coleman looked on with the detached interest of spectators at an auction. Derek stood beside them, his arms crossed, a mocking glint in his eyes that told Naira he was already mentally spending the commission from her sale. Then, the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall groaned open. The sound of rubber wheels on marble was soft, yet it felt like thunder in the vacuum of the room. 2 men in identical charcoal suits, their expressions as immovable as the walls, flanked a man in a high-tech matte black wheelchair. This was Park Hyun Seok. Naira felt the air leave her lungs. The rumors of his accident had painted a picture of a broken, frail man, but the reality was far more terrifying. Even seated, Hyun Seok possessed a physical presence that seemed to warp the space around him. His shoulders were broad, stretching the fabric of a bespoke midnight blue suit that cost more than Naira's entire remaining wardrobe. His face was a masterpiece of cold, masculine geometry, a jawline that could have been carved from flint, and a straight, noble nose. But it was his eyes that froze her blood. They were dark, bottomless pits of intensity, framed by thick, dark lashes that didn't flicker as he looked at her. His hands rested on the armrests of the chair, and Naira found herself staring at the ink. Intricate, dark tattoos spilled out from beneath his white silk cuffs, coiling around his wrists and dancing across his knuckles in a display of beautiful, dangerous art. They were the marks of a man who had survived a world where violence was the only currency. "The bride is ready, I see," Marcus said, stepping forward with a faked cordiality that made Naira's skin crawl. He didn't look at Naira. He looked at the lead bodyguard, as if checking the quality of a shipment. "She's been briefed on her duties. She knows that her primary role is your comfort and the maintenance of your public image." Hyun-Seok didn't respond. He didn't even look at Marcus. His gaze remained fixed on Naira, a heavy, silent weight that felt like he was peeling back the layers of her soul to see what remained of the woman who had lost everything. "Sign the registry," a grim-faced official directed, gesturing toward a table where a single document lay waiting. Naira walked toward the table, her legs feeling like lead. As she reached for the pen, her hand brushed against the armrest of Hyun-Seok's chair. He didn't pull away, nor did he acknowledge the contact, but she felt a strange, electric hum of energy radiating from him. He wasn't the limp, lifeless figure the Colemans had described. There was a coiled tension in his frame, a controlled power that suggested a predator in repose rather than a victim of tragedy. She signed her name, Naira Coleman Park. The hyphen felt like a chain. "Congratulations," Gloria whispered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she leaned in to hug Naira, a gesture that was really just a way to whisper in her ear. "Don't screw this up, Naira. If he sends you back, the street is waiting, and we've already changed the locks." With a final, mocking wave from Derek, the Colemans turned and walked toward the exit, their laughter echoing through the hall until the heavy front doors thudded shut behind them. The sound was final. The last link to her old life had been severed. Naira stood alone in the center of the obsidian floor, the silence of the mansion pressing in on her. She looked down at the man who was now her husband. Up close, the scent of him was intoxicating, sandalwood, rain, and something metallic, like the edge of a blade. "Mr. Park," she whispered, her voice cracking, I don't know what you expect of me." Hyun-Seok remained motionless. His hands, those tattooed, powerful hands, stayed perfectly still. He didn't speak a word. He didn't give her a smile or even a nod of reassurance. Instead, he simply tilted his head a fraction of an inch, a silent command to his men. "The boss is tired," the lead guard said, his voice a low rumble. "His suite is on the second floor. You will follow us. Your room is adjacent to his. You are to be on call 24 hours a day. If he moves, you move. If he needs, you provide." As they began to wheel him away, Naira followed behind, a shadow trailing a ghost. She looked at the back of Hyun-Seok's head, wondering what was hidden behind that mask of paralyzed silence. She had been sold to a man who couldn't walk, but as the elevator doors closed them into a private, claustrophobic space, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being hunted. The first week in the Park mansion felt like living inside a cathedral carved from ice. Every surface was polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting Naira's solitary figure as she moved through the vast, silent corridors. Her life had been reduced to a strict, repetitive rhythm, the administration of medicine that Hyun-Seok never seemed to struggle with, the changing of linens that smelled of expensive cedar, and the long, quiet hours spent in his private study. The Colemans had warned her of his cruelty, but the reality was far more haunting. Hyun-Seok was a void, a man who occupied space with a terrifying stillness, his dark eyes following her every movement with an intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up. Despite the coldness of her surroundings, Naira could not bring herself to be anything but kind. It was not a choice born of weakness, but of a fundamental refusal to let the Colemans' bitterness infect her soul. She treated the silent man in the wheelchair not as a burden or a monster, but as a person. When she entered his room in the mornings, she pushed back the heavy velvet curtains to let the soul's sunlight dance across the floor, even if he didn't acknowledge the warmth. When she bathed his hands, those large, powerful hands covered in tattoos of dragons and thorns, she did so with a gentle touch, careful not to scrape his skin with her nails. One rainy afternoon, while she was organizing the books in his study, the silence of the room became too heavy to bear. Hyun-seok sat by the window, staring out at the mist-covered mountains, his expression as unreadable as a stone mask. To ground herself, Naira began to talk. At first, it was just small things, the way the tea smelled or the pattern of the rain against the glass. But soon, the dam of her loneliness broke. "Daniel used to hate the rain," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic, echoing slightly against the high ceilings. "He was a pilot, you know. He said the clouds felt like walls when he was up there. He always wanted to be above them where it was always sunny." She paused, waiting for a reaction, a blink, anything. Hyun-seok remained motionless, but his gaze shifted almost imperceptibly from the window to her reflection in the glass. Encouraged by the lack of a dismissal, she continued. She spoke of her childhood, of the dreams she had before the Coleman family had tried to erase her. She spoke of how she had wanted to be an architect, to build things that would last longer than people. She spoke of her grief, not with the performative wailing the Colemans had expected of her, but with a quiet, dignified sorrow. "They think I'm empty because I didn't have a child," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she dusted a shelf near his chair. "They think my only value was as a vessel for an heir, but I loved him, and I think I just wanted to be seen as a person, not a property." She didn't notice how Hyun-seok's jaw tightened at her words. She didn't see the way his fingers, hidden beneath the silk throw on his lap, twitched with a sudden, violent urge to reach out and pull her to him. To him, her voice was the first warm thing to enter this house in years. He had spent his life surrounded by people who spoke to him in lies, threats, or terrified whispers. Naira spoke to him with a vulnerability that was more dangerous to his resolve than any rival's blade. As the days turned into weeks, her devotion only deepened. She began to bring him small comforts, a single flower from the garden, a book of poetry she thought he might like, or the specific type of bitter coffee she noticed he favored. She would read to him for hours, sitting on a velvet ottoman at his feet, her voice a soothing balm in the stagnant air of the mansion. She told him about the things she missed, like the spicy street food in the Myeongdong markets or the way the Han River looked at midnight. "I wonder if you ever liked those things," she mused one evening, looking up at him. "Before the accident, I wonder if you were a man who laughed or if you were always this quiet." She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from his tattooed hand before she pulled back, blushing. "I'm sorry, I talk too much. You're probably wishing I'd just leave you in peace." If she had looked closer, she would have seen the fire in his eyes, a burning, protective heat that had begun to replace his cold indifference. Behind that silent, paralyzed exterior, the shadow dragon of soul was no longer just observing a captive. He was watching a woman who had been broken by the world yet refused to be unkind. He was listening to every dream she whispered into the silence, carving them into his memory like a vow. He was falling for the widow who saw the man behind the mask, unaware that the cripple she was comforting was already planning a world where she would never have to cry again. As she stood to leave the room that night, she paused at the door. "Good night, Hyun-seok," she said softly. He didn't answer, but as the door clicked shut, he let out a breath he had been holding for an hour, his eyes fixed on the spot where she had been sitting. The test was over. He had found what he was looking for, but the cost was a heart he hadn't planned on losing. The morning of Naira's 25th birthday arrived not with a celebration, but with a hollow ache that settled deep in her marrow. In the gray, pre-dawn light of her bedroom in the Park estate, she lay staring at the intricate crown molding, remembering how a year ago, Daniel had woken her with a tray of burnt toast and a lopsided grin. Now, there was only the oppressive silence of a mansion that felt more like a mausoleum for the living than a home. She expected nothing from the day. To the Colemans, this was just another Tuesday she hadn't spent earning them a profit. To the world of soul, she was a ghost bride to a silent shadow. She rose with a heavy heart, smoothing the silk of her robe over her deep brown skin, and began her morning ritual of preparing herself to care for a man who never spoke. But as she reached for the door handle to head toward the kitchen, the heavy oak door creaked open before she could touch it. Naira froze. It was barely 6 in the morning. Normally, the guards didn't bring Hyun-seok to the residential wing for another hour. But there he was, sitting in that sleek, predatory wheelchair, framed by the shadows of the hallway. He was alone, without his usual phalanx of black-suited shadows. The dim light caught the sharp angle of his jaw and the dark, swirling ink on his hands, making him look like a dark deity carved from obsidian. "Hyun Siok," she whispered, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird against her ribs. "Is something wrong? Are you in pain?" She rushed toward him, her instinct to nurture overriding her confusion. She knelt before his chair, her eyes searching his for any sign of distress. But for the first time in weeks, his gaze wasn't just intense, it was focused. There was a clarity in those dark depths that she hadn't seen before, a vibrant, living energy that made the air between them feel thick with static. Then, the impossible happened.
Happy birthday, Naira.
Happy birthday, Naira. The voice didn't sound like that of a man who had been silent for months. It was deep, resonant, and vibrated through the floorboards, a sound like velvet pulled over rolling thunder. Naira gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she stumbled back, her eyes wide with a shock so profound she felt dizzy. She had spent weeks pouring her soul into the silence, never once expecting it to echo back. You can speak," she stammered, her voice trembling. "How? The doctors said the Colemans told me." "The Colemans see only what they want to see," Hyun Siok said, his voice steady and commanding. It was a king's voice, used to being obeyed, yet there was a fraying edge of softness to it when he spoke her name. "They are blinded by their own greed. They see a broken man because it makes them feel powerful. They don't see the man who hears every word you whisper in the dark." Naira felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks as she remembered everything she had confessed to him, her grief, her loneliness, her secret dreams of building a world where she wasn't just a bargaining chip. He had been listening, every single word. "Why?" she asked, her breath hitching. "Why tell me now?" Hyun Siok maneuvered his chair closer, the hum of the electric motor the only sound in the room. He stopped just inches from her, so close she could smell the sandalwood and the faint, crisp scent of the morning air on his suit. "Because today is for you," he said, and for the first time, a ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting, dangerous thing. "And I am tired of watching you look at the world as if you have no place in it. You have been a light in this house of shadows, Naira. You treated a monster with a kindness he didn't deserve. It is time you were rewarded." He gestured with one tattooed hand toward the center of her room. "I have a surprise for you, but you must trust me. Turn around, Naira. Do not look back until I tell you." Naira hesitated, her mind reeling. The man she thought was paralyzed was speaking. The man she thought was a void was offering her a gift. The mystery of him was expanding, threatening to pull her under. But when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see the cruelty Marcus had promised. She saw a fierce, protective fire. She turned slowly, her back to him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her chest. She stared at the closed curtains of her balcony, the silence of the room returning, but it was different now. It was no longer a heavy, suffocating thing. It was pregnant with anticipation, vibrating with the presence of the man sitting directly behind her. She stood there, her breath shallow, waiting in the stillness of the soul dawn. She wondered what could possibly be behind her. A gift? A document? Or was this another test in a long line of trials? "Keep your eyes closed," his voice rumbled, closer now, the heat of his presence blooming at her back like a physical touch. "Wait for it, Naira. Wait for the moment everything changes." She squeezed her eyes shut, the darkness behind her lids filled with the sound of his voice and the scent of his skin, unaware that the greatest surprise of her life wasn't a gift she could hold, but the man who was about to prove that everything she knew about him was a lie. The silence in the room was no longer the empty, hollow thing it had been for months. It was thick, charged with a magnetic energy that made the very air vibrate against Naira's skin. She stood with her back turned, her eyes squeezed shut as Hyun Siok had commanded, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain intensified, swirling around her until it felt as though the shadows themselves were closing in. Her mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, but none of them could have prepared her for the reality that was about to shatter her world. Suddenly, the floorboards behind her didn't creak, but the air shifted violently. Before she could gasp, a pair of immense, warm arms wrapped firmly around her waist. The contact was electric, a sudden jolting heat that seared through the thin silk of her robe. She was pulled backward, her spine meeting a chest that was as solid and unyielding as a wall of granite. She felt the rhythmic, powerful thrum of a heartbeat against her shoulder blades, a heartbeat that was steady, slow, and terrifyingly alive. Naira froze, her blood turning to ice. A scream died in her throat as the primal fear of an intruder gripped her. She knew Hyun Seok was behind her in his chair, but the height of the man holding her was all wrong. This person was towering, their chin resting just above the crown of her head, their grip possessive and unshakable. "Who?" she started, her voice a terrified wheeze. "Hush!" the voice rumbled. It was the same velvet and thunder she had heard moments before, but now it vibrated directly into her bones. The arms tightened, pulling her even closer into a protective embrace that felt both like a sanctuary and a cage. Naira's heart hammered against her ribs like a panicked bird. With a surge of desperate adrenaline, she twisted in the stranger's grip, her hands flying up to push away the intruder. But as she spun around, the words of protest died on her lips, and her knees nearly buckled. Standing before her, tall and magnificent in the dim morning light, was Park Hyun Seok. He wasn't in the chair. He wasn't slumped or broken. He stood at least 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders blocking out the light from the hallway, his posture as straight and commanding as a soldier's. The black fabric of his suit moved with the fluid grace of a predator as he looked down at her, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that made her entire body tremble. Naira staggered back, her hand clutching the edge of her dresser for support. You're standing," she whispered, the words sounding like a prayer or a curse. Tears blurred her vision hot and fast as the sheer impossibility of the sight took hold. "Hyun Seok, how? The accident, the paralysis. I've spent months bathing you, talking to you while you sat there like a statue. Why would you lie to me?" The hurt in her voice was a physical thing, a jagged blade that cut through the air. She felt a crushing sense of betrayal. Every intimate word she had whispered to his silent form now felt like a secret he had stolen. Hyun Seok took a step toward her, a heavy, purposeful stride that proved his strength was no illusion. He reached out, his large, tattooed hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness that contradicted his fearsome reputation. His thumb brushed away a stray tear, the rough ink of his knuckles a stark contrast to her smooth, deep brown skin. "The accident was real, Naira," he said, his voice low and aching with a sincerity she hadn't expected. "The scars on my body are the proof, but the paralysis, that was a choice. In my world, weakness is a death sentence, but power is a magnet for vultures. I needed to know who would remain when the shadow dragon had no teeth left to bite with." He stepped closer, invading her space until she was forced to look up into the dark depths of his eyes. "I have lived my life surrounded by women who wanted the title, the black cards, and the blood-stained empire. The Colemans thought they were punishing you by throwing you to a broken man. They thought you would neglect me, or worse, try to rob me." He paused, his hand moving to the back of her neck, pulling her gently toward him until their foreheads touched. "But you treated a ghost with the dignity of a king. You spoke to my soul when you thought I couldn't hear you. You showed me a kindness that had no price tag. I needed to find a woman who loved the man in the chair, Naira, because I knew that if she could love me at my lowest, she was the only one I could trust at my highest." Naira let out a sob, her hands tentatively reaching out to touch his chest, feeling the heat and the hard muscle beneath his shirt. The betrayal was still there, but it was being swallowed by a tidal wave of relief and a strange, burgeoning hope. "You let them treat me like a slave," she cried softly. "I let them think they had won," Hyun Seok corrected, his grip tightening as if he were afraid she might vanish. "But the game is over now. Today is your birthday, Naira, and my gift to you is the truth. From this moment on, you are not a widow and you are not a nurse. You are the wife of the most powerful man in Seoul, and I am going to spend every day for the rest of my life making sure the people who hurt you pay for every tear you shed." As he pulled her back into the miracle hug, Naira finally let go, her head resting against his chest. The man she had been caring for was gone, replaced by a king who was ready to go to war for her. The shift in the Park mansion was not merely atmospheric, it was a total transformation of power. The silent, cold halls now vibrated with the presence of a man who no longer hid his strength. For Naira, the days that followed the great reveal were a whirlwind of dizzying luxury and terrifying devotion. Hyun Seok did not just provide for her, He worshipped her with a ferocity that seemed designed to erase every scar the Colemans had ever inflicted. On the week of her birthday, a custom-built Rolls-Royce, as black as a raven's wing and as silent as a secret, appeared in the driveway, its keys pressed into her palm with a quiet command that she never walk the streets of Seoul unprotected again. But the crown jewel of his devotion was a legal document that transferred 20% of his primary shipping empire into her name, a move that overnight made the poor widow one of the most powerful women in the city. However, wealth in Seoul is a beacon for those who hunt in the dark, and no one had a keener scent for money than the Coleman family. Marcus, Gloria, and Derek had spent the last year burning through Daniel's inheritance with the frantic desperation of people who knew they were living on borrowed time. Between Derek's gambling debts in the underground dens of Gangnam and Marcus's failed real estate ventures, the billionaire estate they had stolen from Naira was evaporating. When the news hit the social circles of the elite that the paralyzed Park Hyun-seok was not only walking, but was showering his black bride with the kind of fortune that could buy a small country, the Colemans didn't feel joy. They felt an insatiable, rotting greed. It began with a phone call that Naira took in the sanctuary of the mansion's garden. "You owe us, Naira," Marcus's voice crackled over the line, stripped of its former smugness and replaced by a jagged, desperate edge. "We were the ones who arranged that marriage. Without us, you'd still be scrubbing floors. We're calling it a family tax. $10 million transferred to the offshore account I've sent to your email, or we'll make sure the public knows exactly how you manipulated a disabled man into giving you his company." Naira stood among the white roses, her heart racing, but her voice didn't waver. The woman who had wept in the mud of the cemetery was gone. "I don't owe you anything, Marcus. You stole Daniel's life from me, and then you sold me like property. If you ever call this number again, I will let my husband know. And we both know you aren't prepared for what happens when he loses his patience." She hung up, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a newfound righteous anger. But she had underestimated the depth of their desperation. The Colemans didn't see a warning, they saw a challenge. 2 days later, Naira insisted on a moment of normalcy, driving her new car to a boutique in central Seoul to pick up a gift for a charity auction. She hadn't noticed the gray van that had been trailing her since she left the estate, nor did she see the 2 men in nondescript jackets watching her from across the street. As she returned to the parking garage, the air suddenly felt heavy, the usual bustling sounds of the city muffled by the concrete walls. Before she could reach the driver's side door, a hand slammed against the glass. "Don't scream," a voice hissed. 3 men, their faces partially obscured by caps and masks, surrounded her. One of them brandished a jagged knife, its blade catching the dim overhead light. "The Colemans said you'd be carrying the keys and the cards. Hand them over. Now." Naira's breath hitched. They didn't just want the car, they wanted to humiliate her. They forced her to hand over her phone, her designer handbag, and the keys to the Rolls-Royce. But they didn't stop there. With a cruel laugh, one of the thugs grabbed the diamond necklace Hyun-seok had fastened around her neck only that morning, snapping the delicate gold chain. "Marcus said to tell you that this is just the down payment," the lead thug sneered, shoving her hard against the concrete pillar. "Next time, we won't be so gentle." They piled into her car, the engine roaring to life as they sped out of the garage, leaving Naira collapsed on the cold, oily floor. Her knees were scraped, her phone was gone, and she was stranded in a part of the city where she was a stranger. As she dragged herself to her feet and stumbled out into the bustling, indifferent streets of Seoul, the rain began to fall, the same cold, punishing rain that had seen her at her lowest a year ago. She stood on the sidewalk, shivering in her torn dress, watched by thousands of strangers, feeling the old familiar sting of being discarded. She was alone, penniless, and bruised, but as she looked up into the rainy sky, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt a cold, hard clarity. The Colemans had made their final mistake. They thought they were robbing a widow, but they were declared war on the dragon's queen. And as she began to walk, she knew it was only a matter of minutes before the shadow of Park Hyun-seok fell over the city to find her. The neon lights of Seoul blurred into streaks of jagged electricity through the veil of the downpour. Naira stood on the curb of a rain-lashed intersection, her breath coming in shallow, visible puffs of white. Her silk dress was plastered to her skin, and the raw scrape on her knee burned with the sting of road salt and grit. She was a woman who had once been a billionaire's wife, now reduced to a shivering figure that the passing taxis ignored. But as she hugged her arms across her chest, she didn't feel the old despair. She felt a strange, vibrating pulse in the air, a hum of impending thunder that told her the world was about to shift. Back at the Park estate, the mask of the disabled victim didn't just slip, it shattered into a million sharp pieces. The moment the GPS on Naira's Rolls-Royce went dark and her personal emergency beacon flared, Hyun-seok was no longer the man in the chair. He was the dragon. His command center was a hive of controlled violence as he stood before a wall of monitors, his tattooed hands braced against a steel table. "Find her," he roared, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that made the glass partitions rattle. "If a single hair on her head is out of place, I want the heart of every man involved in this. And find the Colemans. Bring them to the Deepwater warehouse. Now." In less than 6 minutes, the might of the Park Syndicate had paralyzed the district. Black SUVs swerved through traffic with surgical precision, and every street camera in a 3-mile radius was redirected by his hackers. Naira was staring at her own reflection in a dark puddle when the screech of tires tore through the sound of the rain. A fleet of black vehicles surrounded the intersection, blocking traffic in 4 directions. The doors flew open, and a phalanx of men in dark suits stepped out, but Naira only had eyes for the man in the center. Hyun-seok stepped out of the lead car, ignoring the umbrella his men tried to hold over him. He moved with a predatory, lethal grace, his long strides eating up the distance between them. When he reached her, he didn't speak. He simply pulled her into his chest, his large hands trembling slightly as they cupped the back of her head, shielding her from the storm. He felt her shivering against him, felt the dampness of her skin, and a low, guttural growl escaped his throat. He stripped off his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her, lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "I have you," he whispered against her temple, his voice thick with a terrifying promise. "The world will pay for this night, Naira, I promise you." By midnight, the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside the shipping warehouse at the edge of the Han River. The air was thick with the scent of rust, salt, and raw fear. Marcus, Gloria, and Derek Coleman were zip-tied to cold metal chairs in the center of the vast, hollow space, illuminated by a single, flickering industrial light. They were still in their evening wear, looking absurdly out of place amidst the grime. "Do you have any idea who we are?" Marcus screamed, though his voice cracked with terror. "You can't do this. My lawyers will." The heavy sliding doors of the warehouse groaned open. The sound of rhythmic, heavy footsteps echoed against the corrugated metal walls. From the shadows emerged a figure that made the Colemans' blood turn to ice. Hyun-seok walked into the light. He wasn't in a wheelchair. He wasn't leaning on a cane. He stood tall, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the entire room. He had rolled up his sleeves, revealing the dark ink of dragons and thorns that coiled up his muscular forearms. Gloria let out a strangled, pathetic whimper. "But, you're a cripple. We saw the medical reports. We saw you." "You saw what I wanted you to see," Hyun-seok said, his voice a cold, flat line of absolute authority. He stopped inches from Marcus, looming over him like a god of vengeance. "You saw a way to pay off your gambling debts. You saw a way to steal a widow's home. But you were so blinded by your own greed that you didn't realize you were selling the woman I love to a man who owns the very ground you stand on." He reached out, his tattooed hand gripping Marcus's jaw with enough force to make the older man moan in pain. "You sent thugs to rob her. You left her in the street like she was nothing." Hyun-seok leaned in, his dark eyes burning with a demonic light. "I spent months listening to her cry for the husband you robbed her of. I spent months watching her be kind to a man she thought was broken. She is a queen, and you are nothing but insects crawling in the mud." He stepped back, signaling to his men who stood in the shadows with heavy lead pipes and cold, indifferent expressions. "The cripple you mocked is the last thing you will ever see as free people," Hyun-seok promised. "Tonight, you learn that in Seoul, there are fates far worse than prison, and I am going to make sure you experience every single one of them before the sun rises." As the screams began to echo through the hollow warehouse, Hyun-seok turned his back and walked toward the exit, his mind already returning to the woman waiting for him in the safety of his home. The debt was being collected, and the dragon was finally satiated. The following morning, the industrial grime of the warehouse was replaced by the cold, sterile brilliance of the Seoul Central District Court. Hyun-seok knew that, while blood could satisfy the rage of a single night, only the absolute annihilation of the Coleman's reputation and wealth would ensure Naira's peace. He had spent the early hours of the dawn mobilizing a legal battalion, a team of the most ruthless, high-priced attorneys in South Korea, armed with a mountain of evidence that his intelligence network had been quietly gathering since the day he first set eyes on Naira in the cemetery. Naira walked into the courthouse at Hyun-seok's side, her head held high. She was draped in a tailored suit of cream-colored silk, her skin glowing against the fabric, a stark contrast to the bruised and haggard figures of Marcus, Gloria, and Derek Coleman. They sat at the defense table, their designer clothes rumpled, and their eyes wide with the realization that their world was collapsing. They had been brought here straight from the warehouse, stripped of their bravado and replaced by a primal, shaking terror. The courtroom was packed with the very elite the Colemans had spent years trying to impress. The air was thick with the scent of scandal. Hyun-seok sat in the front row, his presence a silent, looming threat that kept the room in a state of breathless tension. He didn't need to say a word. The way he stood, his tattooed hands resting calmly on his knees, told everyone that he was the architect of this reckoning. "Your Honor," Hyun-seok's lead counsel began, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "We are here to present evidence of a conspiracy so vile it borders on the inhuman. The defendants did not merely lose the Coleman estate through poor management. They systematically defrauded a grieving widow, manipulated legal loopholes to strip her of her rightful inheritance, and finally, committed the ultimate act of human trafficking by forcing her into a marriage contract under duress." A murmur rippled through the gallery as a series of documents were projected onto the large screens. There were the original, unaltered copies of Daniel's will, which Hyun-seok's hackers had recovered from a hidden server Marcus thought he had wiped. There were recordings of Derek bragging in a Gangnam club about how they were selling the black girl to a cripple to pay off his baccarat debts. But the killing blow was the footage from the penthouse security cameras, video that showed Gloria throwing Naira's belongings into the hall, while Marcus threatened her with homelessness if she didn't sign the park marriage contract. Naira took the stand, her voice steady but laced with a poignant, heartbreaking honesty. She didn't speak of money. She spoke of the husband she had loved and the dignity the Colemans had tried to steal. "They told me I was worth nothing because I had no child," she said, her eyes meeting Marcus's with a coldness that made him flinch. "They treated me like a ghost in my own home. They didn't just want the money, they wanted to erase me." As the evidence piled up, fraud, embezzlement, coercion, and the hearing of thugs for the robbery, the judge's expression grew increasingly grim. The Colemans' defense team, realizing they were fighting against the bottomless resources of the Park Empire, offered only a stuttering, pathetic silence. The verdict was a total, scorched earth victory. The judge ordered the immediate freezing of every asset held by the Coleman family. The billionaire estate was to be returned to Naira in its entirety, including the companies, the international accounts, and the Seoul penthouse. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. For the crimes of fraud and the orchestration of the kidnapping and robbery, Marcus, Gloria, and Derek were sentenced to 15 years in a high-security prison. "This court finds the actions of the defendants to be a stain on the integrity of this city," the judge declared, his gavel striking the wood with a sound like a gunshot. "You sought to profit from grief and vulnerability. Instead, you have found the end of your freedom." As the bailiffs moved in to handcuff the Colemans, Gloria let out a shrill, piercing cry, begging Naira for mercy. Marcus stared at the floor, his face the color of ash, while Derek collapsed into his chair, weeping like a child. Naira didn't look back as they were led away. She felt a weight that had been crushing her for a year finally lift. She walked out of the witness box and straight into Hyun-seok's waiting arms. He pulled her close, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his eyes soft with a pride that was for her alone. "It's over, Naira," he whispered. The sound of the courtroom's chaos fading into the background. "The house is yours, the name is yours, and no one will ever dare to look at you with anything but respect again." They walked out of the courthouse together, down the stone steps where a sea of reporters waited. But the dragon and his queen didn't stop for the cameras. They had won their war, and the only thing that mattered now was the quiet, powerful life they were about to build on the ruins of their enemy's greed. The shadows that had haunted the Coleman penthouse for so long did not vanish overnight, but they fled eventually under the sheer force of Naira and Hyun Seok's presence. When Naira first walked back through the doors of the home she had shared with Daniel, she expected to feel the suffocating weight of his absence. Instead, she found a blank canvas. With Hyun Seok at her side, no longer a silent observer in a chair, but a man whose every step echoed with a promise of protection, she began the work of exorcising the ghosts. They stripped away the cold, clinical gold and the heavy curtains that the elder Colemans had loved, replacing them with warmth, light, and vibrant art that celebrated her heritage and their shared future. The house was no longer a monument to a dead marriage. It was a fortress for a living one. Hyun Seok, true to his word, had dismantled the Coleman legacy with surgical precision. Every mention of Marcus or Gloria was scrubbed from the social registers of Seoul, and the legal battle had left them so destitute that their names became a cautionary tale whispered in the very clubs where they once held court. But while the world focused on the scandal, Hyun Seok focused on Naira. He integrated his shipping empire with the assets he had recovered for her, creating a combined dynasty that was untouchable. Yet, for all his power, his favorite place remained the quiet corner of the library where Naira would read to him, not out of duty anymore, but because he loved the melody of her voice when she was happy. A year passed, a season of healing that saw Naira's laughter return to the halls of the penthouse. The garden was no longer a place of secret tears, but a sanctuary of blooming jasmine and laughter. On the first anniversary of their court victory, the atmosphere in the home changed again. This time, it was filled with the soft, rhythmic hum of a nursery. On a crisp, clear evening in Seoul, Naira stood on the expansive glass balcony that overlooked the glittering tapestry of the city. The Han River wound like a silver ribbon below, reflecting the neon heart of the metropolis. She was draped in a gown of deep emerald silk, her skin glowing with a peace that surpassed anything she had known in her youth. In her arms, she cradled a bundle wrapped in the finest cashmere, a tiny, sleeping boy with his father's sharp, noble nose and a dusting of dark hair. The door behind her opened, and the familiar, grounding scent of sandalwood and rain preceded the man who had become her world. Hyun Seok stepped onto the balcony, his silhouette tall and imposing against the lights of the city. He didn't say a word as he came to stand behind her, echoing the miracle hug from the morning of her birthday. His large, tattooed hands settled gently over her own, his thumbs brushing the soft cheek of the infant. "He looks like you when he sleeps," Hyun Seok whispered, his voice a low, warm rumble that vibrated through her. Naira leaned her head back against his chest, closing her eyes as she felt the steady, powerful beat of his heart. "He has your stubbornness, though. I think he's already trying to run the nursery." Hyun Seok let out a rare, genuine laugh, a sound that was once impossible but was now the soundtrack of their lives. He looked down at his son, the true heir to the Park Empire, the child the Colemans had claimed Naira would never bear. The boy represented more than just blood. He was the ultimate victory over every person who had ever tried to diminish her. He was the future of a legacy built not on greed, but on a devotion that had survived the darkest of shadows. "The world belongs to him now," Hyun Seok said, his gaze shifting from the baby to the sprawling city below. "And to you. I spent my life building a throne of ice, Naira. I never knew it needed a heart until I found you." Naira turned slightly in his arms, careful not to wake the baby, and looked up into the dark, fierce eyes of the man who had faked a fall just to see if she would catch him. "We built this together," she reminded him, "from the ashes of what they tried to burn." The lights of Seoul twinkled like 1,000 fallen stars, and for the first time since she had arrived in the city as a young bride, Naira felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. There were no more secrets, no more wheelchairs, and no more ghosts. There was only the warmth of the man she loved, the breath of the child she adored, and a horizon that stretched out before them, vast and full of light. As the clock struck midnight, marking the start of another day in their new beginning, the shadow dragon and his queen stood together, watching over their kingdom in a silence that was finally, perfectly, peaceful.